First of all, it's
Okay.
fantastic to meet you at last because, you know, having been in the same country for 50 years, it's amazing that we haven't crossed paths, but then that's what we haven't crossed. Oh, I know. And but you've got a way better microphone than I have. I'm just
Well,
using the
we can
plug
talk
that you.
about, yeah, we can talk about this microphone because it is a special mic. It came from the Rolling Stones mobile recording studio circa 1970 something or other.
Nice.
And I bought it from Bill Wyman, who bought the Stones mobile and then sold it. And it's probably had Mick Jagger's lips around it. It's had Elton. It's had well, I've recorded two Stones. That's Bill Wyman
Yes.
and Charlie Watts, who were
Nice.
working on a project together called Bill Wyman's Rhythm Kings,
Yes. Great. I love it.
and then they did an album called Willie and the Poor Boys.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. I heard that too. Yeah. That's good.
And I've got, you were asking about funny stories. All right. Well, the funny story is Chris Rea is not someone who's very well known in America.
Is that
Okay. Yeah. Driving Home for Christmas. It was early days. Chris was still pretty popular here, but Bill Wyman was doing this Willie and the Poor Boys project. And, you know, I said, look, I'll tell you what, there's a great singer who lives up the road. His name's Chris Rea. Bill never heard of him, really. He said, well, get him down, get him down. So Chris pops down, and it's early 70s. Chris isn't the snappiest dresser in the world. In fact, at this time, he used to wear sort of boiler outfits. He sort of put on a bit of weight. You know, he didn't really look like the rock star. Anyway, he happened to be in this accommodation part of the studio because I recorded two albums with him at the Mill with Elton John's producer, Gus Dudgeon. Anyway, he happened to be bending down at the washing machine at the time, I think. I don't know why. But Charlie Watts happened to be in the room. Anyway, I said to Chris, we're doing Baby Please Don't Go. You know, I guess most of us know that song. He didn't really know it, so he had to learn it. And a few hours later, we're in the studio. Chris is singing live with Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts. I don't know who the others were, but he's doing his version of Baby Please Don't Go. Anyway, Charlie at one point comes in the studio. Chris is in the recording room. He says, you know what? He's not got a bad voice for a plumber, has he? Yeah, and I don't know if you have to meet Charlie to know he's extremely deadpan
yes.
to
Yes.
to the point of like you really don't know actually whether he's taking the mickey or not.
That's
But
right.
anyway, I said, well, no, he's not a plumber. He's a singer, songwriter. He says, oh, what band's he in then? And I said, well, he's not in a band, you know, he's on his own. And there was ridiculous conversation. He said, why can't he get anyone to play with him? Anyway, he's extremely eccentric. I think maybe people think that Charlie Watts is the sensible one, but actually he's probably the most eccentric out of all of them.
Well, it's the jazz
Um,
thing, right?
yeah, that's it. And
It makes me think about meeting people who are really talented, who are not successful, and seeing how they are perceived by others. I mean, for instance, you know, Reg was
yeah.
one of the guys in the studio, and then suddenly,
Well, you
yeah,
say that, but I spent a lot of time with him. Of course, I met him when I was 15 years old.
exactly.
At I was working for Dick James, the Beatles music publisher. Reg was signed as a songwriter primarily because Dick James Music was primarily, well, it was at that time, a music publishers.
Hmm.
So Reg was in the studio making demos, well, pretty good demos actually, with Caleb Quay, and but he's a great guy, you know, and he was very, very flamboyant. And for a 15-year-old from Edgware, well, actually Mill Hill in North London, I'd never met anyone quite like him. You know, he's
Oh,
very flamboyant in his dress. He was but there was a lot of flamboyant, outrageous people. To be honest, there was some unusual people floating around the office and in London in 1967. I mean,
mhm.
everyone was freaking out. So in a way, he didn't look out of place particularly. But what was different about him was when he sat at the piano and played me a song that I've never heard before, and this was the first time this had happened,
Mhm.
and I was just taken away. I mean, it was one of the first times I heard a song for the first time with someone playing it live in front of me, and it just gave me all the chills and everything else. And I just thought this guy's amazing. So
Indeed.
we became friends, and he was very shy. Actually, maybe people don't realize that he was quite shy at the time. And we used to take him around North London, you know, some of the Jewish, I suppose they were, you know, delicatessens and joints in Edgware and Mill Hill, and take him to my parents. And he was very shy, very quiet. Anyway, it's a long story, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, then he started doing gigs, you know, small-time gigs in theaters, and, well, not theaters, actually, they were colleges and universities. And at the same time, you know, it's the story, he met Steve Brown, and then Steve started producing him. We then formed a label at Dick James. You know, when I met Elton, I was the office boy. I went from office boy to disc cutter to studio engineer, and then I became assistant to the head of the record company that we formed, which was DJM. And primarily we were working on Elton's career, because he was definitely the best singer songwriter at the time who was signed. And in fact, Steve Brown, who not many people talk about or know about, he pretty much discovered Elton and got him on the road. He was the guy that was managing Elton, took him to LA to play at the Troubadour, that famous gig. And I wasn't there, but, you know, I was getting all the reports back, and next minute he's headline news of the Melody Maker in England, which was the first time. But then on the second tour, Steve didn't really want to go. He was a bit fed up with that. So, Stuart, do you want to go on tour? Of course, absolutely. So aged 18, I met everyone at the airport, and here we started on a 3-month tour of America, with me sort of assisting Elton. I suppose I was personal assistant. You know, it was an amazing time, really, because he hadn't been going down great in the UK, people ignoring him, not really that interested. But you guys in America, you just took to him like we just couldn't believe it, you know, you know, loved him to bits, absolutely loved him to bits. The Americans, you took him to your hearts, loved the music, loved the Englishness of it all. And so, you know, I was there at Carnegie Hall, we played, and, you know, some of these, they're small venues, really, theaters. But anyway, it was the start of Elton's career, which obviously, as we know, took off and became supersonic and larger, to be honest, than any of us imagined. The only one who properly perceived how large he was going to get was Elton.
Right. Well, maybe so. But there are a couple of things that what you just talked about have made me think.
Sure, yeah.
The first thing is, at 18, for them to put their trust in you at that time, you must have been a pretty together kid. I mean, let's face it, you wouldn't entrust somebody who was a flake to do that job. So what was it about what you'd done before that that impressed you?
Well, to be honest, I would say we were all in the same boat, because we kind of, you know, in those days, it's only when you look back, you realize how quickly everything happened, because at the time it seemed to drag on, you know, time just dragged on. But actually, from my age 15 to 18, so much happened in my life, and also with Elton. You know, we made this first album that never got released. We made Empty Sky, then we made the first Elton John album, and his career was really going quite fast without us really even noticing. And then plus the Troubadours. So, but we were all in it together. We were all as naive, if you like, as each other.
Somebody was in charge of the kind of financial side of it.
Well,
right?
That's Dick. That's the great Dick James.
But what is it about you that impressed Dick, that said, well, I can trust this guy, this kid, he may be young, but man, you know, he's doing the job for me.
Well, Dick James, unfortunately, he was portrayed, and I was only just talking about this today, absolutely appallingly in the film Rocket Man. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen happen to anyone, really. You know, as far as we never heard Dick James swear. He was a gentleman. You know, he could get angry, and he was a pretty firm boss, but we never heard him swear, and he didn't talk like a secondhand car dealer. So they've got that all wrong there. So, but he was a very fair chap, and he put his trust in Steve Brown, who was now in charge of Elton's career. So an example of that is that Empty Sky had been made on a shoestring, you know, maybe £1,000, £2,000 or something. But when we wanted to do the new Elton John album, which had your song, the budget came down to £5,000, which at the time was like 100 grand or something. It was a fortune. So it's an example of the way that Dick James put his trust in the team, because Steve went to Dick. He said, we need 5,000. Dick said, fine. You know, he believed in Elton. He believed in his songwriting. You know, he could hear a good song. I mean, Dick was a singer. Dick was a singer, for goodness sake. So he could tell, you know, he might not have agreed with the guy's character exactly, but he was very fair. And so he put his trust in. But really, we were a team on our own. So the team that met, which I was very happy to be a part of, I mean, the main thing was that I'd been friends with Elton for 3 years, 4 years. You know, we all liked each other. So it was mates in a way. You know, we had tour managers, we had lighting guys, sound guys. So it was really only
taken care of. The sort of technical side of it was taken care of. So
right,
your side of it on tour, at least, was to make sure that Elton was happy. He had his tickets for the airplane.
We always got on well with the same star sign. I loved his music to pieces. He's a very funny guy. He's actually a great guy to be with.
Yeah.
Some of the time he'd be looking after me. He's so professional.
Yes.
That doesn't get spoken about much. You know, people are more interested in what he spends on flowers and this sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah.
But he's extremely professional. And let's face it, he'd learnt his profession. You know, he'd gigged all over the place. He'd been a session guy on other people's sessions.
I love the fact that you've pointed that out about him, because everybody who I've talked to who's worked with him said, you know, the guy's a professional studio musician, and he started that way. And you were fortunate enough also to work with the guys in Led Zeppelin, were also studio players way before they formed the group. A friend of mine, Steve Rowland, who you may know, all of his productions, he used those guys, the Led Zeppelin, as his studio band. John Paul Jones did all his arrangements. So you know, it's a different thing working with studio people, because they know the process really well.
I mean, these are the old days that we're talking about, when you did have to do a certain amount of groundwork. You had to be a great musician to be doing what you were doing. So, and then when it breaks, you know, when it finally happens and you're now selling records and it's all going well, then hopefully you know how to deal with it in a professional way. And I mean, you know, I worked with Jimmy. I worked on the last Zeppelin album, but I only worked with Jimmy and Robert. And Jimmy, I mean, in a slightly more haphazard fashion, if you like, than Elton to some degree, but also a genius in the studio. Beyond musicianship, you know, I always say that it's one thing being able to play an instrument or sing or be a great singer or be a great musician, but you have to have the brain and the passion and the like you do in any other business to a certain extent, you know, to make it really work as a business and for it to go places. And certainly Elton John has that, and Jimmy Page and Robert Plant.
Yes.
And I've been lucky to work with some of these people who, in a way, spoil you for things to come when you work with.
Well, you know, and that's another good question. I mean, professionalism in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, some aspects of Jimmy Page was a little bit not quite. But do you know what? There isn't a musician that anyone would know that springs to mind. I mean, all right, we were talking about Charlie Watts, and how eccentric he is, and we were doing this track with Bill Wyman, and the band was all out in the studio. They're playing away. I'm recording it. It's all going great. Suddenly, it all stops because Charlie had stopped playing. He'd not only stopped playing, he stood up and he started walking around. And Bill said, and he suddenly goes over. He saw a picture that wasn't straight.
Oh, I see.
And wanted to make the picture straight, and he wasn't happy with the track. So that was a bit strange. So that wasn't particularly professional. But I mean, it's only a small story because, you know, I've worked with Paul Rodgers. I've worked with some of the best musicians, drummers, guitarists.
Yes.
And to be honest, it's only in recent years where I'm now being able to be hired by people that I don't know very well out in the public. And one of the big things now is that everyone's got recording facilities at home. You know, they've got all these basic music programs. And so there's unfortunately a lot of unprofessionalism that goes on
Yeah.
there
Yes.
because actually they don't know what the professional route is.
I kind of feel it's like somebody telling me, "Oh, I've got a Ferrari," but they don't know how to drive a Ferrari, you know, and
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
kind of like that. You've
I'm not,
got some,
I'm not sure it's quite as dangerous as what you've just
well, it's
described.
dangerous to my ears.
Yeah, that's right. They feel that you know, they've got a Beatles record or a Oasis record on here, and
Yes.
now they've got the equipment here, and they think, well, I should be able to produce the same sound. It should all be quite easy. I've got all the
Hmm.
same stuff.
Yeah.
And then well, from my point of view, it's actually pretty good because they find out that actually recording isn't difficult. You know, you can press a button and it'll get recorded. You can play it back, and you can do this 100 times till you've got 100 instruments all playing. But
Right.
somehow it still doesn't sound like a record.
I
Yeah,
went to a very, very famous studio recently to
yeah,
record some strings because,
right.
as you know, I do a lot of strings.
Yes, I've
And
seen. Was that Capitol Studios by any chance?
I'm not going to tell you which studio it is because of the
Oh,
nature of the story. I'm going to
fair
be a
enough.
good boy and not rank on anybody. But I
Fair
went to a
enough.
very, very well-known studio in LA,
Yeah,
and I walked in, and there are the microphones on the strings. It was only a quartet, you know,
yes.
and there were the close mics. And then I walked in, and I said, "What about the overheads? Oh, you want
Oh,
overheads?
yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
you want overheads?" I said,
yeah.
"Yes." So the guy brought it in, young engineer, and
Yes.
he put the overheads about a foot above where they were sitting.
Not particularly overhead then, really.
No, no, exactly. And I said,
Yeah,
in fact, that's what I said. I said the
yeah.
word overhead kind of means,
Way up here.
and he said, "Oh, really? You want it up there?" Now,
Okay.
I've got to tell you, man, I've been recording, well, since the late 60s all the way through, and I have never gone into a studio where an engineer didn't know how to mic a string section. I mean, excuse
No,
me.
that's not good.
I'd say, I
Well,
mean, but so
that's not
this is
good.
what I'm asking you. The question I'm asking you is
Yes.
compare the whole way that people used to. I mean, look, you were kind of you were the tape op, you were the assistant engineer for years
Yes.
before
Yeah.
you actually started engineering yourself.
Yes.
Obviously, you learned stuff,
That's right. Yes,
but
you
these
did.
guys don't seem to do that.
No. But what I was going to say is, in a way, it's sort of lucky for me that they don't know their way around it all. Otherwise, I wouldn't get hired. You see, they
Well,
wouldn't need me. So I've got a great career now, another career, fixing people's home recordings. And
yes,
I say I'll make it into a record. Someone came in, a young person came in to the studio at the mill. We had a 9-foot Bechstein there, and they sort of walk over to it and they go, "Well, what's this?" I said, "Well, it's a piano, you know, well, it's very big, isn't it? What sort of sounds can you get out of it?" "Well, you know, you get this sound out of it and you sort of play the piano." And they say, "Yeah, that's very good. Anything else?" "Well, not really, no." "How much is one of these?" "Well, it's about $50,000. And then they sort of pass out in disbelief.
exactly. Yeah,
But I suppose the lucky thing is that somehow or other we've ended up in the 21st century where there are still youngsters who want to hit pieces of wood, drums, they want to strum guitars, they want to learn Stairway to Heaven, Smoke on the Water. You know,
yeah,
it seems like the music from the 60s, the era that we started out in,
yes,
is almost more relevant now than it was then,
yes,
however, how did that happen? I mean, obviously we know how it's happened because it turns out that music was rather good. It was a bit special one way or
yes,
another, and
yes,
it almost can't be bettered. It can only be tried to be almost copied and
yes.
rehashed, you know.
Stimulated. Yes.
Which
Well,
is,
I
and
mean,
so we're very lucky that we're, you know, every band, which is your favorite band, they say Led Zeppelin, who split up about 45 years ago.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
it's it's totally mad, really.
From the 50s and 60s, we created not only new music, new forms of songs, new ways, new forms of telling stories in songs, but I've got to say, for me, all through my career, it always seemed to me that the engineer never got enough credit for what they were doing, because the engineer can be the difference between something brilliantly played on a piano or a guitar or a violin or whatever, sounding like crap or sounding absolutely heavenly. And
Of course, yeah.
that's why, I mean, it seems to me the engineer is never assumed to be an artist. They're assumed to be the technical staff. And in fact,
Yeah.
at the BBC, you know, they wore white coats, and I was working when they were in those days when they were, but
Yeah.
but I don't
Yeah.
think that's true at all. You have to have an artistic sensibility to make those thousands of choices that you can make of, should I give this a little, you know, 2-to-1 compression? Should I use, you know, does it need a little more 4K? Whatever it is, you know, you have to make those decisions. There's a technical side to it, but of course there's an artistic side.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other thing that I tell youngsters who I'm working with is that in our day, it sounds like our parents when you say that, but music was made by teams of people.
Yes,
It wasn't made by one person sat in front of a screen or sat in front of even a microphone or recording desk.
yes,
It
yes,
was made by teams of people working together. You know, also we have that thing called bands, you know,
yeah,
which was pretty popular. So
right,
you've got like 4 or 5 guys, or maybe girls and guys, all shouting at each other, which was often the case, pulling things apart, pulling arrangements apart.
right.
Each one playing a part in the band. You know, bass player, guitarist, pianist, singer, songwriter. Everyone trying to get their bit in order to create this product. You know, and I also think that had so much to do with how great the products were. You know,
Absolutely.
you got the producer and the engineers working together. And I always also say that it's very rare that you get one person who is able to do all these things.
Indeed.
You know, you get a Stevie Wonder or a Michael Jackson
Yes.
who
Well,
really is
Michael
capable.
Jackson had a hell of a team.
Yeah.
He,
Well, he
he,
had a maybe I shouldn't use him as the example, but Stevie Wonder definitely, he could go in a studio and
yeah,
he was half blind as well, you know,
yeah.
but he could be the engineer, he could be the drummer, he could be the
Indeed,
singer.
indeed, indeed. And I think
Well,
you'd agree that, I mean, I worked with McCartney a lot, and he could
yeah.
very easily play everything and sing everything, and it would be brilliant.
Well, very jealous of you for doing that.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
should be interviewing you, really, shouldn't
Man,
I?
I'm jealous of myself because it was a great experience. And you know, here's
Yeah.
the interesting thing. Maybe you've had this experience before. You're going to work with somebody. When I knew I was going to work with McCartney, all these people who had worked with him said, "Oh man, it's going to be terrible. He's very
Oh, did they?
controlling. He'll never
Oh,
let you do anything. He's
I've
very,
never, I've never heard that. I never heard that.
yeah." Well, all I can say is everybody warned me about how difficult it was going to be
Wow.
to work with McCartney. I
Yeah.
I I was spent about a year with him, and it was
Wow. Wow.
utterly
That's
pleasant,
amazing.
charming, friendly. Couldn't have been nicer.
That's
Couldn't
not
have,
what he told me.
well, yeah, exactly. Well, he probably didn't feel that way about me, but actually he did.
Uh,
But we got,
well, I'm very
it was
jealous.
fine. And I
I'm
can
very
see why
jealous.
other people might have a hard time with him. But have
Yeah.
you had those situations with people where they say, "Oh, he's a great guy," and you find him to be difficult, or he's going to be difficult and you find him to be easygoing?
I was backstage with John Lennon before he went on with Elton John at Madison Square Gardens for this incredible concert in 1974.
Yeah.
And it's not quite the same thing, but he was crapping himself. He was so nervous. And I'm going, what's the matter with the guy? He's done everything, he's seen everything, he's been
Mm.
everywhere. How can he possibly be nervous? That often when you don't know these people, when you haven't met them, it's often the case that they're more subdued or shy. Like I was saying, Elton was very shy. I mean, I never got to work with Paul. Mind you, there's still time.
There's
Maybe
still time.
if you could put in a good word for
I
me, that
will.
would be
Yeah, yeah.
great.
I'll
But I
send you
did,
a picture of you in your hat.
I did get to work with George. You see, George came to. It wasn't much in the way of work, but he came to the studio in Cookham There's a film of it actually on my Facebook at the moment.
Nice.
And he'd just done this film, Shanghai Surprise, which he wrote well, actually, he came to the Mill a couple of times. He came there when Bill Wyman was there, and he was extremely shy. Amazingly enough, he seemed also quite not that brilliant with sound and this sort of thing, because I was showing him some of the things in the studio, and I found myself saying, oh, this is the thing that I use to get that across the universe acoustic sound, you know. And he was very shy, I mean, and sort of actually what he also was very putting down his own talents as a songwriter and as a singer, you know, in front of me. I mean, I didn't even know him very well, and he's going, well, I've written a couple of songs. They're not as good as, you know, the other guys in the band, but they're all right.
Yeah.
He played himself down, and I don't think I was expecting that.
Yes.
From him or from John Lennon to be so
absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and I've heard that too, Stuart, from people who have worked with him. They said he was very self-deprecating.
That's the word.
That's the word. And they also said that he was also one of the nicest guys to work with, and had a great sense of humor and joking around all the time.
Absolutely.
And of course,
absolutely.
My friend John Altman worked with him, of course, with the Pythons, and so that was great.
Now, I'm glad that you brought up John, because I just saw him on your Facebook or on your website.
That's right, yeah.
And you probably don't know that I know John from over 50 years ago. It might even be 56 years ago.
Nice.
When we were really little kids.
Yes.
And John Tubular Altman, I think we used to call him. And he just used to have us in absolute awe, because he could play two saxophones at the same time, which I don't even think we'd seen one person play one saxophone at a time. But yeah, so I've known John all those years. He's a great guy, a great player.
Yeah, terrific guy. And as you know, I've got I featured him in my first of my series called Musicians Funnies. Some of your funnier stories will go into that.
And I'm saving one for you.
Oh, good. Well, lay it on me now. Go ahead. Musicians Funnies.
Well,
hit me, Stuart.
Musicians Funnies. Well, to be honest, it's not very funny for me when it happened. It wasn't funny at all. It's only funny when you recount it, and it's now I don't know, 30 years later. Yeah. So I'll recount the story, and of course it features Reginald Kenneth Dwight, otherwise known as Elton John.
Right.
So what was happening was, we were at the Mill Studios, which is in the village where I'm talking from now, which is Cookham in Berkshire, beautiful village. We're at Elton John's producer's studio, Gus Dudgeon. Right. But Gus isn't actually producing this. This is my friend Clive Franks, who's producing this album, which turned out to be called Single Man. Anyway, we've been recording all day, and at various times in the day, Elton had said, look, before I go home tonight, I've got this idea of a song I want to put down. So we said, all right, and we carried on, forgot all about it. Anyway, now it was about 11 o'clock. Everyone had gone home. Clive and I were about to go home. And Elton suddenly says, oh, no, I must just put this thing down. So we're going, oh, all right. He said, it won't take 5 minutes, And you've always got to worry when someone says that.
Yes.
Anyway, he goes out in the studio, and he tells us it's an instrumental. It's not a vocal. We only need the mics on the piano. He just wants to put this thing down. So I get a bit of tape or something or other. I think I better put multi-track on there just in case. So I put some multi-track on, and he starts playing this thing, which you'll recognize the tune because it goes da 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 da. Very nice tune, very nice tune. Yes. However, we're recording it, and we only get about 30 seconds in. He makes a mistake. So, all right, stop, go back to the top. Okay, and then we off again. Da, 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 da. Mistake, stop. You know, and I don't know whether you probably have heard that Elton's he's not got the best, you know, he can get a bit upset if things aren't going well. So he's starting a little bit to get a bit upset with himself for not getting the song right, for keeping us back. But, you know, anyway, record again. Da, 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 da. Anyway, this time he's roaring. He's into it. He's probably about 2 minutes into it. We're thinking it can't be much longer. I look round, and to be honest, I haven't put anything like a full reel of tape on there.
Oops.
You know, it was a bit of tape that was left because I thought, well, it can't be that long. He says it's not that important even. But then he's like, duh, 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 and then I'm looking at the tape machine thinking, do you know what? There really isn't a lot of tape here. And this is the first time he's got through this song. And it's taken about an hour and a half to get to this point. So now both Clive and I are getting a bit worried, because in the terrible event that we ran out of tape, well, we'd just be dead. That would be the end of that. So we're sort of almost willing him to finish this song.
Yeah.
It's going on and on. Da, 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 da. If you listen to it, you can hear da, da, da. Now I look round at the tape machine. I don't know whether you've ever seen that happen, but you almost can't tell how much tape's left.
Yes.
It's like when you're looking at your fuel gauge on a car.
Yes.
And it says empty, but you may think, well, maybe I've got another few yards to go. Anyway, now we're both sweating away. We're killing ourselves, you know, come on, finish this bloody thing. You know, the tape's almost running out. It's running on air, really. No word of a lie. He finishes the last chord. As the last chord dies away, the tape goes shh and runs out.
Right.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So we both fell on the floor.
Yes.
And he sort of goes, did you get that? We went, yes.
Yes.
And
but
so
did you tell him how close he came to not getting it?
I only told him a couple of years ago, and he wasn't particularly interested. I'll be honest. He couldn't really care less. Because the fact is, though, that was the start of what became one of his biggest hits of all time.
Yes.
You know, we put another piano on it, then we put another piano on it, put strings on it, and it built up into this thing that became number one. But it very nearly ended up on the floor. And
I think there is a sort of a magic to the days of tape, because
magic is the word.
Because of the imperative that is always hanging over you, like the sword of, you know, Damocles' sister. If you don't get it in time, the tape is going to run out. It can run out.
Well, there's all these. That's why I call my talks that I did in colleges the magic of recording.
Yes.
Because there was always that magic. There's the times when I'm sitting in the control room and I've got a whole band out there, maybe with Elton singing live, or maybe with Paul Rodgers, you know, a great singer, and you're halfway through it and you just know this is the one.
Yes.
Because they've maybe done a dozen before that and they weren't as good as this is the one. So now you're sitting there praying to all the gods of studios that there isn't a power cut, that the tape machine doesn't break down, the mic doesn't go off, which they can do, you know that. Anything can almost happen. So when it gets to the end, you know, they often used to say, did you get that?
Yeah, exactly. And it reminds me also of, you know, I find that the physicality of tape is a wonderfully tactile thing, that you're almost touching the music, you know. And I was recording Pat Metheny's album American Garage. We had just recorded this beautiful track. Of course, anything they recorded was beautiful. But in the middle of this beautiful track, there was a big click. I don't know if you've ever had that. Just suddenly a click appears from nowhere.
Of course, yeah.
And I said, "Oh, geez, you know, we ruined it." And so the engineer was this great engineer in America called Kent Nebergall, and he said, "Oh, no problem. Don't worry. Let me just look at this." So he took the 24 track out, and he didn't. He figured out where the click was, but not only that, he figured out where on the 24 track, which track it was. So he said, "Oh, that's all right. It's track 17." So then he makes a little mark with a chinograph, the famous chinograph. And for those of you in the audience who don't know what a chinograph is, you probably got one on your desk there, but it was a little wax pencil in yellow or usually yellow that you could mark the tape with.
Yes.
And he held it up. He said, just hold this piece of tape. And I had a piece of cloth around it so I could, he said, hold it really tight. And I said, what are you doing? And he took a pin and he went, pow,
Wow.
just like that. And I said, that's it.
Wow.
You've ruined everything. He said, don't worry about it. It's fine. I got it
Yeah.
right in the middle of where the Chinograph was. I said, you've just ruined everything. I'm going to kill myself. And sure enough, the click was gone.
Wow.
Have you ever seen anybody do something like that?
Well, no, because we used to do it a different way. I'll be honest. We didn't ever do
Tell
it
me.
that way. Bill used to call it spot welding.
Yes.
So what you used to do is put that track in record and then hold the tape, and literally you make a mark where the click is, and then you just go backwards and forwards on that tiny, you know, whatever it is, like 1/2 inch per second piece of tape.
Yes.
So you're spot erasing that click.
Yes.
So instead of physically cutting it with a razor blade,
yes,
you'd be spot erasing it. Because admittedly, the click might be, like you're saying, it was only on one track. It wasn't across the whole 24 or 16, yeah.
Right.
But the thing is that the person that I haven't spoken much about, who spoke a lot about Elton, but the guy that I learned a lot of this from was Gus Dudgeon, who's
absolutely, yes. I want you to talk about him.
Yeah, unfortunately not with us anymore, but
no.
He was the most very English, very eccentric as well. But you know, I learned so much from him, mainly the limits that he would go to, because for him there was no limits to how far he would go to create the sound that he wanted. You know, we'd spend a week on a tom-tom or a triangle or something like that. You know, he was never bothered by how long it was going to take, how much it was going to cost. It was just getting the best result possible. And when it came to editing, I mean, I used to have to tell people in the room, right, Gus is going to edit now, please be quiet. He didn't even like people breathing, particularly when he was editing.
No.
You know, it was such a special magic thing that he was doing. And so when you learn from someone like that, he was like a George Martin, I suppose. It's an amazing privilege. Actually, it was a privilege to work with him, because, you know, I'd worked with him when he was producing Elton's first albums, as far as in the record company. But when he built this Mill Studios, which was the most technically advanced studio in the world at that time, I was now actually physically working with him in the studio. So that was quite a different thing. And to be honest, it was an honor. It was an absolute honor. I mean, admittedly, it was a very tiresome honor at times, because he would spend 18 hours in the studio while you're trying to keep your eyes open.
Right.
So that was the only problem, but it was an absolute honor to work with him and to see how he worked.
What was your very first solo production gig? Well, I'm kind of talking about after the Gus Dudgeon experience.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, see what I mean?
Well, the only thing about the Birds, they were called Birds of a Feather. And it was quite good because I had Elton John on piano and Rick Wakeman on keyboards. And I was only a kid. And actually, the only thing that bothered me was that it was at Trident Studios. This was my big moment. I was now going to be the producer. And when I walked into the control room, the chap that I was telling you about, Steve Brown, was sat in the producer's chair.
Right.
And all I cared about was sitting in that bloody chair. I thought, if he doesn't move, I'm going to go home.
How did you get him out of the chair?
Luckily, we were just about to start and he moved, and I got straight in that chair and didn't get out of it again for about 3 months.
Great. Well,
but following, because what happened was that Gus had the Mill Studios for about 5 years, then had to sell it. And so he sold it to Jimmy Page. And yeah, what was great at that time was that Jimmy was telling people about the studio and would they like to come and use it. So, you know, George Harrison came down, Mick Fleetwood, Bill Wyman, as I told you. And then also there was some bands on the Atlantic label that Jimmy was on. And so I suppose the most well-known one was Twisted Sister, who, to be honest, I wasn't really crazy about their music. In fact, I thought it was pretty horrible. But they were great guys. You know, they turned up at the studio. They said, "You're producing our album. Phil Carson's told us you're the guy." They're all running about. and
Great.
they turn out to be really nice guys. And I heard a track in there that I thought, wow, it sounds like My Generation by The Who. I thought, well, that could be a hit. You never know. So I suppose that was the most important production, because it was also a big hit, that I did on my own following the Gus period. Well, I definitely had it in my mind I wasn't going to spend as long as he did, and I wasn't going to. It wasn't going to cost £500,000 either.
Yes.
So I had to sort of decide that I was going to cut corners,
Yes.
And to be honest, what they called heavy metal
Yes.
wasn't quite the same as Your Song or 60 Years On.
No, it wasn't.
So you could kind of cut corners and still get a great sound. I'll tell you, because Gus is looking down on me, and he might not want to hear this, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Go ahead.
That what I cared about, a lot of times when Gus was working with artists, they weren't that crazy about the production.
Right.
Or that it took 10 years to make.
Yes.
They kind of weren't that crazy about it. So
Yeah.
I wanted to do productions that the artist liked.
Great.
Which might seem obvious, but in
No,
those days,
yeah.
in those days, it was what the producer wanted.
Yeah.
And the producer was kind of doing what he thought the record company wanted.
Yes.
And the artist just had to go with whatever they were given, really,
Yes.
in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And if it happened, and if it happened to all coincide, which, to be honest, on Elton's career, it did. Elton liked the productions, the record company liked the productions, the public liked the productions.
Exactly.
So it was all fine. But actually, when he was working with some of the other artists, that they go, oh, I didn't really see it that way.
I've always said there are different types of producers. Each producer
Yes,
has their own. They're approaching it from someplace different. Like, for instance, you, unlike me, are a fantastic engineer, and you understand that side of it way better than I could ever understand it, even though I've been working in studios for 50 years.
Right.
So that's because you came at it from that starting point.
Yeah, I came over from that point of view. Yeah,
I came at it from being a musician arranger.
Yeah, musician. Yeah, absolutely.
So for me, the arrangement is very important. I think of that, and that's my input to the track.
Yeah.
I'm saying, well, let's do this here, and this would be nice with a little choir underneath it, or whatever it is, And so we all have our different things. George Martin was kind of, I had a brief chat with George Martin. He's featured in my book here, which I think you'd be fascinated by.
Yes, I'm sure.
Called The Invisible Artist, and it's all about arrangers in popular music. But of course, one chapter is on George Martin, and the interesting thing for me was that he came at it from the point of view of being an absolutely brilliant arranger, and yet, interestingly enough, he's not given credit on any Beatles record for any of the arrangements he did, when in fact he arranged 90% of them. And
that is crazy. Yeah, that is.
Yeah,
crazy.
it is crazy.
I didn't know that. I suppose, though, the fact that he was probably getting 3% of a Beatles album was the compensation.
Well, yeah, except whether or not EMI actually gave him that. Yeah, apparently, what I've heard is that he got nothing for most of the Beatles albums because he was an EMI contracted producer.
Yeah,
so he just got his salary, and that was it.
That's probably right. Isn't that crazy? I've never heard anyone talk about that or anything. Yeah.
Well, I talk about that a lot in this book. And the other thing is that he said he got paid 15 quid for his arrangements. Now, I don't know how much, for instance, when you were doing the Elton John album, how much was paid for the string arrangements, or
Yeah, well, good question. Well, Paul Buckmaster was the arranger,
exactly.
But I think 15 quid was what that was almost double what the musicians were getting for a 3-hour session. Because I used to book all the musicians.
Right.
I think it was £9.
£9. That's right. I remember.
So actually, 15 quid was probably quite good.
Yeah.
For 1967 or something.
Yes, exactly. Very interesting. Now, we've talked about what the younger generation can learn from us old farts. But I also would like to
talk
about what production techniques would you say you've learned from what modern contemporary production techniques do you think you've learned from, or are you using today in your productions?
Well, I'll tell you what I hear. As a good example is that it's a few years ago now. You'll realize that when I say who the artist was, but I was in the car, got the radio on. I don't often listen to the radio, but a track comes on, and I just think, what is that? Who is that? It's a great voice. It's a great sound. It's a great song. I love it. Who is it? And generally they didn't tell you who it was at the end, but it turned out to be Ed Sheeran.
Right.
Because I'd never heard of Ed Sheeran. I don't know who he is. And I think, well, blimey, that's really, really good. And it happened again on another single, I guess, until, because the same thing happened. I didn't know who it was. It was like hearing a new artist for the first time, but great sound, great voice, great production. I then played them in my studio, and 9 times out of 10, when something really hits the charts, or is some new artist like Ed comes along, although that doesn't happen very often, I do marvel myself at the recording quality and the production value. I liked what you said about the input that different producers have, that some come from like I worked with John Leckie, who came from an engineering background.
Right.
So he's very laid back in the studio. He really just sits there, and while the band's getting on with it, and he doesn't really get involved in the arrangements too much, or what people are playing, is just in charge of it all going down.
Yes.
Whereas you're saying, like with yourself, and also that was the case with Gus, he'd start with the demo, and he'd pull the song apart before starting on the recording. He's very into the arrangement, and I'm like that as well. I mean, I don't do it for its own sake, but if the chorus is at the beginning and the verse is at the end, I tend to say, I think there's something wrong with this song here.
Yes,
because I write songs myself. So
I was lucky enough for the book to interview Jerry Wexler, and that's actually up on the Radio Richard site. And Jerry was just unbelievable. It was such an honor to be able to talk to him, because he was so articulate and such a thinking man about music. And so he talked about working with these great rhythm sections. And I kind of have the feeling that it must have been a little bit like the Led Zeppelin experience, that you've already got an existing rhythm section, that they're all professionals and they played a lot together already. So there's a kind of a inbuilt thing. And of course, with Jerry Wexler, he had not only the guys in New York, but especially when he went down to Muscle Shoals and the Stax group of musicians, they already had a lot together. And he called this collective arranging rather than having an arranger hand out parts. And I'm sure you've experienced that many times, and I have once in a while, when I've been lucky enough to have rhythm sections that I know have played together a lot. So that's an interesting other side of production, and knowing how to let them get on with it. I mean, it was the funniest line that Jerry Wexler said. He said, well, with Ray Charles as a producer, all I did was turn the lights on in the studio, and he didn't even need that.
Oh, very good. I like that.
I only met Robbie Williams once when he was in a certain band, and when I arranged some hits for them. And I've never worked with the guys in Oasis, but there are people who are sort of notorious for being wild and crazy guys. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about, because I know you worked with both of them.
Yes, that's good. So the two very different, although the weird thing is that Robbie ended up going out with the same girl as Liam Gallagher, which was a bit weird, because they hated each other, Liam and Robbie, in the end. Not at the same time, and not in the same room.
Good.
But the thing is that I'd started the studio after the Mill. I'd started the studio in Alvin Lee's studio. Alvin Lee from 10 years after.
Yes.
And I made it into this commercial studio. I brought in my own mixer that Gus had invented almost. And I was trying to get more artists to book it, And at the time we had this thing called Britpop.
Yes.
So we're talking about the mid-90s. And Paul Weller had actually, who's way up there in Britpop, had been into the studio. He liked it. He's a great guy, a really nice guy to work with. He told Liam about the studio, Liam Gallagher from Oasis. And next minute, I'm sitting there and the phone goes from Oasis's office. And to be honest, this was, it was like McCartney ringing me up. I mean, it was the best thing for my studios. Although I wasn't a big Oasis fan, they were the biggest of the Brit pop
Yes,
band.
indeed, they were huge.
So next minute they're saying, yeah, Liam wants to book the studio, or Oasis want to book the studio. And it was a bit of a story because the roadie had obviously said, what shall I bring? And he must have said everything. When I turned up at the studio, which was a big studio, it was a very big studio area, there was every single amp, every single microphone, every single instrument. He had about 120 guitars. Anyway, Noel arrives. To be honest, he wasn't very chatty. He didn't look me in the face. He wasn't really that friendly, to be honest. But anyway, we started, we were working on what became On the Shoulders of Giants. And the guy is unbelievably well talented. He's a total brilliant professional. He's a great instrumentalist. Most of the time I was thinking, why has he got Oasis? I mean, he's got a great voice. They're all his songs. Why does he need that band? It seemed mad. So he's doing everything himself. Got Mellotrons. He's a real techno. He's not techno. I mean, he's into all the old instruments.
Right.
At one point he said, I want to get this John Lennon acoustic sound. So he goes behind him and he gets John Lennon's acoustic out that he's bought, that was John Lennon. Right. He puts the microphone on it that John Lennon would have put on it, the C12.
Right.
And surprisingly, it sounds like John Lennon.
Surprisingly,
because he then plays it.
Yeah.
But anyway, after a few days, he then says, right, we're packing up. He said, Liam's found out that we're here. He's going to come down. He'll trash the place. We better get out before he arrives.
Nice.
So I'm thinking, great. Well, that's great. They're supposed to be here for 2 weeks. I said, well, that's not very good, Anyway, while we're talking about this, Liam arrives. He suddenly bursts into the studio, and he's the opposite to Noel. He is totally friendly. He's absolutely great. He loves the room. I mean, it was a great room. He said, actually, it looked like Jimi Hendrix's bedroom.
Yeah.
And later on, I wanted to know how he knew that. He was totally brilliant, and we got on like a house on fire. He's playing me songs, and actually, him and Liam for the next few days, they got on great. They had a few drinks together, and you got an idea of what, because I never saw Oasis live, but when these two were working together, you got an idea of the force that was kind of behind them.
Yes.
Because Liam's the front guy, and he's got the voice and he's got the look. And then you've got Noel, who's the brains and the songwriter.
Yes.
So it wasn't, you could really see. And also, the thing that I haven't mentioned is that they had all this old equipment, apart from guitars, microphones. They also had compressors the size of my room, equalizers from Abbey Road that were huge, with like cobwebs all over them.
Yes.
And I'm sort of thinking, but what do we want that for? This desk is sort of modern.
Yes.
But anyway, they used all this stuff. And at the end of it, you got to say what came out the other end was the Oasis sound.
Yes.
Which was sort of like the Beatles, but with their songs. So
exactly.
It was a great session. And unfortunately, then the two of them just, they fight like, because one of them's extremely rich. The other one isn't quite so rich. So they would fall out.
You mean Noel is extremely rich?
Yes, because he's the songwriter, isn't he? So there's this right. Look, you must know this rivalry that exists when you've got two brothers in a band. Apparently the Everly brothers were like that, and the brothers in the Kinks, they want to kill each other and all this.
Yeah.
This other call that I got when I had the studio was from Chris Briggs. I don't always remember his name.
Yes, I do.
But Chris Briggs is a great music guy. He rang up because I'd rung him and said, listen, I got this studio. If you've got anyone that wants to, record, obviously it'd be good if they were well known, bring them down. So he rings up, he says, right, I've got a project for you guys, Robbie Williams. He wants to work on a new album. So I said, great. I didn't know much about him because, he's from Take That.
Mm.
And it's hard to imagine, but at the time, his solo album, Life Through a Lens, I think Chris said it had sold about 20,000, and it was really dying. It had finished. It finished.
Yeah.
So he's got to come in, but they were sticking with him, and you know, he's going to come down. So Robbie turned up with Guy Chambers.
Yep.
So I haven't met either of them, but a great duo, basically, and a really brilliant duo.
Yes.
You know, Robbie, not the best voice on the planet, to be honest. And what was also interesting about the session was that he'd do his vocal. I wasn't producing. There was a producer there. I can't remember his name. Robbie would do his vocal, and then he'd go, and then in through the back door would be this massive amount of tuning equipment that would come in, because it was at the time when that it almost just been invented, that tuning, you know, the tuning.
Yes. Auto tune
equipment.
Yes.
Auto tune, exactly. And so, but they didn't want him to know. Because
yes.
they thought he'd be up. They thought he'd be upset if he had to be told, "Well, we tuned your voice."
Yes.
But what I found with Robbie, he was like an actor singer.
Yes.
And I think that he learnt to sing by listening to himself.
Yes.
You know, so when he heard himself now perfectly in tune,
yes,
he would then copy that next time he did a vocal.
And so I think Robbie Williams kind of had to learn how to become Robbie Williams. And I think you're so right explaining that's why it was.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah. And in fact, it was quite funny because I don't know whether you've heard of Norman Wisdom. Have you heard of Norman Wisdom?
Remember, I first came to London in 1962, so I know Norman Wisdom very well.
Well, you know, for people who don't know him, he was this crazy guy who's always falling over, you know, making a fool of himself. And I was actually sitting with Robbie when he was watching Tom Jones.
Yep.
He was watching something with Tom Jones, and he said, look at that guy. Why can't I look like that when I'm dancing around the stage? He said, whenever I see myself, all I look like is Norman Wisdom.
Yeah, very true. I understand that. Yeah.
But what Robbie's still got going for him, is that he's only got to look at the camera, and he's sort of got this mesmerizing.
He's got a charisma, I'd say. Yes.
Yeah, that's the word. He's got the charisma. Yeah, and he's also pretty good at putting words together. So
yeah.
He used to ask me about Elton and say, you know, how did Elton do this and how did Elton do that? And
so, which is great because I think that shows the respect that he had for what went before. Yeah. And I think, you know, we all can only learn from what's gone before, not to copy it, but to say, okay, that's how that was done. Now maybe I could do this. So I think that's an important thing. Otherwise, the problem that I think we all have, and I'm going to mention this to let you rant a little bit about it. There is a plethora. See, I got another word in there. There are a plethora of different software programs which you can buy, where you can actually buy chord progressions, rhythm sections, recorded beautifully, vocal parts, backing vocal parts, even lyrics. Even lyrics, you can put these tracks together by the numbers. And I think that's one of the reasons why I do listen to radio a lot. I listen to pop radio to hear what's going on. And I would say something like 90% of the tracks I can hear, oh yeah, they're using that loop again. Oh yeah, it's that sample. It's that. And so it's not like somebody going into the studio with a story that they're telling from their heart. It's really just, let's make this commercial bit of product, and they are. I'm not saying that they're not making money, but if you don't believe, as I don't believe, that making a fortune is justification for doing anything in music, then for me, that's the negative thing about today's music. And for somebody like Ed Sheeran, who you very well mentioned as being one of the really talented guys who writes his own songs and has a unique voice, there are a million clones out there because of the technology.
Yeah, because of the technology. Well, you're absolutely right. Everything that you've said is right. And I'm often saying, I think I said it to someone yesterday, who's written a song, and they sent me the demo, and I quite liked it. It was a bit like an early Elton song in a way, but they said, I'm sorry about the piano, because I used, it's all quantized.
Yes,
And
yes.
I said, well, can you play the part? Because you wrote the song. And I was saying, you want to come into my studio, we'll record it again.
Right.
I said, well, if it's your song and you sound like you're not a bad pianist, why don't you just play it from top to bottom in time with a click or something?
Yeah.
And, if it goes out of time, we'll do that bit again.
Yeah.
Instead of quantizing it so it sounds like a robot. Because
Exactly.
then the writer was also saying, this is a very emotional song. It's all full of emotion. It's about this problem and that problem. I say, well, if it's such an emotional song, why do you want a robot playing the piano?
Exactly. And also
So,
another thing which doesn't occur to these people at all is, why not hire a really great piano player?
exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
other people hired Elton John.
Yes.
They had a song, they said, let's get that guy Elton John, or get this guy Reg Dwight. He was a fantastic piano player. Why not?
Well, we obviously think very much the same, and I also say the same thing. It seems to be the case that youngsters feel like they have to do everything, otherwise it's not right.
Yeah.
They have to be the singer, the songwriter, the pianist, the guitarist, the drummer. One way or another, I'll be all those things to make it work. And I'm constantly saying, the few people that have succeeded being all those things, but generally, it's best to leave it to the people that know better, and if it's worth it, if it's worth something, if the song is worth something, then it's got to be worth doing it right. But it's a different era, I think. And, often also I find that some youngsters might want to do it the total opposite way that it's been done before. So a young chap was sitting opposite me here, and we had a good old chat. He was only like 18, I think. And he said, right, so I put his song on. Well, I could see that it was quite a long song because it said 6 minutes on it.
Ouch.
There was a 2-minute intro.
Ouch.
There was a sort of a 15-second verse.
Ouch.
Then there was a solo. Then there was a short chorus, and then it finished.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So I was trying to explain that, there are aspects to that song that were pretty good, but you've kind of got them all in the wrong order. Yeah. And he was actually quite pleased with that, because he thought, in that case, I've created something different then.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So he thought,
but there is kind of a reason why certain things have become form. The form of songs works because storytelling's. I explain to my students. I say, well, you don't tell a story. The guy was run over by a taxi. Then he woke up in the morning. Then he had a cup of coffee. Then they took him to hospital. You don't tell the story that way. You tell it in order, because otherwise people can't understand it. Yeah. Speech works in a certain way. Music works in a certain way.
And I guess, you have to explain it that it's making music is an art form, like drawing a picture, like making a painting, like making a film, like taking a photo. And some of the very basic things of all those art forms haven't actually changed. They, like you say, that you use those things as a basis and you try and make something new, but you don't try and change something that's been kind of working very well. Well, you were talking about Robbie Williams. Now, when he came in to my studio, it was for the second album, and I had to play all the new songs, and I had to, as the engineer, write down the format.
Yes.
So that we could drop in and this, that, and the other.
Indeed.
And although I didn't know Robbie Williams, it occurred to me straight away that the format of all his songs followed the format of songs I've been following for 50 years.
Of course.
There'll be the intro, there's the there's the first verse, there's the bridge, the bridge is the verse to the chorus.
Exactly.
There's the next intro.
Yes.
And I just thought, wow, that's amazing. Well, that album, I think, was called I've Been Expecting You, and that was the reason why EMI gave him $50 million.
Nice. That's kind of
Yeah.
nice. Yeah, well,
So,
there you are. And it's exactly the way that any producer thinks about producing
yeah.
a song. And here's another thing that I thought of while you were talking. It's interesting that the majority of young artists I talk to, and I talk to lots of them because I do quite a bit of teaching, one-on-one lessons and stuff.
Brilliant.
I'm amazed at the amount of ego that these young artists have,
Well,
their lack of humility and their lack of reverence for
that's true.
certain things. I mean,
That's
it
true.
sounds like you and I both. I mean,
Yeah.
I certainly grew up, I was lucky to grow up with a father who was a jazz musician and had worked with Sinatra and people like that. So I grew up
Wow.
loving that music and being respecting it and being very interested, obviously, in people like Nelson Riddle and Billy May and all those arrangers. And then at
Yeah.
the same time, I grew up as a kid in 60s London, going out and loving. I mean, I sat, you talk about Alvin Lee, I sat at the Marquee Club
Right.
probably 20 times,
Oh,
seeing
brilliant.
10 years
Yeah.
after, sitting in the front row,
Yeah.
getting soaked by his sweat, which is kind of gross. But
Yeah.
you know, I
Well,
just
some people
I
would
had
pay
such
for that.
respect for these guys, for these different
Yeah.
musicians, all doing different. But these, a lot of the people that I meet have no respect for anything, and they think they know
Yeah,
better.
and most of the great musicians that I work with, and certainly the ones that became successful, uh, they were happy just to be trying to follow in the footsteps of the people whose music they loved.
Yes, yeah,
And it also wasn't about money. I try and tell youngsters
yeah.
that as well. I don't know any of the Elton, whoever it was, Jimmy Page. They never said, "Oh, this is
But
going to make me loads of money." It was,
absolutely, but
it,
there's another reason for that, Stuart, I think, and that is
yeah,
in those days, the 60s, 70s, 80s, even through the 80s, there were places to play live.
that's
And
true. Yeah,
and although you couldn't make a fortune doing it,
yeah, you could
doing
get
local
by.
gigs, playing in pubs and clubs, you
Yeah,
could make some kind of a living. That's
yeah,
completely gone today. That is utterly
yeah.
gone. If you're an unknown artist, you can't do anything. So the
No,
only way in is to go in at the top. And that's one of the problems. Unless you happen to be an internet genius and and you've got a budget for serious internet marketing,
yeah,
then man, you've got to go in at the top. And that's why they're all concerned about money. And it's a
yeah.
tragedy.
In some respects, obviously there's hundreds of thousands of people, more people trying to make music than there were. And almost everyone has got the capability now of recording, and everyone thinks they can sing and they ought to be able to do it because they've seen it on the X Factor, how you can become great within a week and all this. But it's still that it still needs that magic to produce something special, and for that almost magic situation as well, for it to become a commercial success. It's still almost just as difficult, maybe more difficult. I don't know. There's more competition now than there ever was.
Absolutely.
Like when you were saying, when you were at the Marquee, literally you could become famous by going down well at the Marquee for a week,
Hmm.
because the word soon got round.
Yep.
And some of those people, like 10 years after, like Alvin Lee, like Led Zeppelin, or some of those bands at the time,
Mm.
the word would get round, and it did happen fairly quickly for them, I suppose.
That's the one thing that is different, and it's the one thing I lament, that there aren't anywhere near enough, if there are any clubs where a
Yeah,
newcomer can go on and get paid some decent scale
yeah,
for showing up and playing, and let the audience decide. But of course, the music business doesn't want the audience to make the decision. They want to make decision. So now
yeah.
they control the outlet. So the only outlet, radio, they've always controlled because they can use bribery and corruption to get the playlists that they want.
Yeah.
And as far as Spotify, they're in control of what gets played.
I do tell youngsters as well, this isn't fun, actually. This is hard work.
Mm,
It's all very well to make music. Yeah, great. You can make music as a hobby. If you want to sell it, it's difficult.
yes.
Like you make a piece of music, now see if your friend will buy it for $10. Well, they'll probably say, I don't like it that much.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, so, you know, it's just like any other business. Selling it and making it a commercial success is
yeah.
very, very hard. You know, people expect, I'll tell you, I don't know whether, because we haven't mentioned it, I might as well mention it,
Go ahead.
because you were talking about you like to hear gripes.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And I was thinking that I don't have any. Now I've just remembered the main one.
Good, good. Whip it out.
The main one is that I'm a record producer, and a lot of the people, the youngsters that I work with, actually don't know what a record producer is.
Oh,
So they assume that it's the same as a film producer, and so I'm the one that pays for it, apparently.
yeah, yeah.
So when I mention that I charge for what I do, they're horrified.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I have to point out that it's more like a film director, not
Yes.
film producer.
Yes,
And
indeed.
you know, they're the ones that put it all together, and that
Yes.
actually we do charge, and that
Yes.
we're just like musicians. We need paying for what we do.
And the difficulty of getting paid either by individual clients or by record companies today. In fact, it's even more difficult to get paid
It's
by
more
record
difficult.
companies. And
Yeah.
what I now say, just right at the beginning, I say my charges are 50% up front and the rest in advance.
That's very good. I like that.
Thank you.
I'll have to write that down.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah, I
I'll
think
get it.
you can use that, Stuart.
Otherwise, I'll get it wrong.
No, no,
I'll get it wrong.
you're welcome to
I'll
use it.
get that wrong. I like that. Well, because the thing is that everyone assumes that music's for free now.
No, well, this is it. This is the problem.
You know, you could, I mean, Spotify is almost free, isn't it?
It's completely free.
Yeah.
It's completely free if you don't mind the advertisements.
The adverts.
Yeah, yeah.
Even if you pay for it, I don't know. It's like, you know, we used to save up for a record, didn't we?
Oh man, I did.
Yeah. It used
I
to
was
be
down at the record store every, I knew that the new records came in on a Friday morning. Man, I was there.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember when I bought the first Rolling Stones record.
Wow, yeah.
Man.
Yeah, mine was Rubber Soul, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Because then I was taking it home. No, actually, I'm lying. I borrowed Rubber Soul from a girlfriend.
Yeah.
And as I was taking it home, it rolled out of the sleeve and fell on the pavement and broke. And it broke.
Oh no.
And I just didn't know what I was going to do, how I was going to tell them. Because, the other thing that because I'm onto the rants now, you've got me going with the rants.
Yeah.
When people talk about money and paying for this, that, and the other, I say, do you know what? When I first used to buy records, I think they were about £2.
Mm-hmm.
That was in 1960, whatever, 4. By rights,
I remember.
by rights, a CD should be about $500.
Yeah. Yeah.
$500 for a CD.
Yeah.
For an album, not a CD.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
well,
then
I remember when I saved up, and then I had to line up around the corner. I lived near Sloane Square, and I lined up around the corner to buy the first Who record, the very first Who album.
If you lived anywhere near Sloane Square, I should think you could afford it.
Yeah, not really, not really. But anyway, listen, man, we actually could talk for about 6 more hours.
Yeah, and now we're starting to sound like
a bunch of old farts,
extremely old farts. And you definitely don't look like an old fart.
Thank you.
I have to say, you look like a relatively new fart.
Well,
that doesn't sound good.
I don't know.
That doesn't sound good.
I'll get somebody to come in and take a sniff and find out.
Anyway, yeah, we have to get together in the same room and do all this
again. We definitely will, man. And let's record something together. That would be fun.
I thought we just did.
Stuart Epps, producer, genius, great, beautiful shirt. Thank you so much for coming on Radio Richard.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, pressure, and everything else.
Radio Richard.